Direct from 7 News headquarters, the latest on the coronavirus outbreak, with Michael, Usher and Melissa Doyle.
Good evening, it's Friday night and instead of usual plans, most of you are at home right now staying safe, not spreading as a coronavirus storm gathers outside.
Well, tonight we're here for you with all of the developing details from the people armed with the best information.
Forced quarantine. The Foreign Minister joins me to discuss extreme new measures. COVID-19 hotels. An industry boss explains how they will work. Tracking the curve, we crunch those numbers again and share a little bit of hope. Patient Zero, the first woman diagnosed with the virus in China. She's lived to tell her tale, her story tonight. And an intimate ceremony. We take you to a wedding scaled back in the face of the coronavirus. But first, let's take a look at the very latest major developments.
The major development today, a 14-day hotel quarantine for all travellers arriving back on Australian shores. The Defence Force has been enlisted to help ensure those restrictions are complied with and check on others to ensure they are isolating at home. Alarming new details about the first 2 Victorians to die of coronavirus. Both were cancer patients at the Alfred Hospital. It was only discovered they had contracted the virus after their deaths. And in WA, there have been major steps forward in the cruise ship standoff. As you can see, several passengers have been removed from the cruise ship Artania. Within days, hundreds of others will be flown home on 3 planes to Germany. And the Vasco da Gama is finally being allowed to berth, with Australians on board to be subject to those strict quarantine measures. And in Queensland, the number of people to contract the virus has passed 500, but more than 1 million voters are still required to go to the polls for tomorrow's local council elections. Nationally, the number of people with COVID-19 is now over 3,000.
All right, Mel, thank you. Now, in a concerning development, as Mel just mentioned, 2 Victorians who died as a result of the coronavirus have been revealed to be cancer patients at a Melbourne hospital. Our reporter Estelle Griepink has the latest on all of this. Estelle, good evening to you. More cancer patients are battling the virus, is that true?
Good evening, Michael. Sadly, that's right. 2 more patients here at the Alfred Hospital have been diagnosed with COVID-19, and that's in addition to 3 hospital staff here who work in oncology and haematology. They too have been diagnosed with coronavirus. Now, this comes after it was confirmed that 2 of our first Victorian COVID-19 deaths were here at the hospital. 2 men in their 70s who died on Wednesday. They both were cancer patients here. Now, there is a full investigation underway. Staff are being tested. A lot of them are self-isolating, but at this stage, Michael, no source of the transmission has actually been found.
What's the response been, Estelle, from the Victoria health officials?
Well, Michael, the officials here at the hospital have put out a statement and they've said it's obviously incredibly upsetting for everyone who is involved, but they've said that this situation actually highlights just how devastating coronavirus can be on patients who are already vulnerable. Michael? All
right, Estelle Griepink in Melbourne, thank you.
Now, more on those strict new quarantine measures for Australians returning home. I spoke with the CEO of Tourism Accommodation Australia, Michael Johnson, and asked how long he'd known about these plans.
Look, to be fair, Melissa, it's just been announced this afternoon, and it's all hands on deck this afternoon, very much so.
So did you not know before today?
No, we had no indications whatsoever. But what I can say is that our industry has been gearing up in preparation to assist the health department should there have been a need with the virus expanding for hospital beds that become strained, and so we've been gearing up to ensure that hotels could support in the recuperation process, which we've been doing previously when we've done for new mums, when they're second and third time mums, where they've recuperated in hotels.
Yeah, look, it makes sense. I just hope that you might have had a little bit of forewarning before it was announced today. But we know that state and territory governments are footing the bill. Do you know yet how many hotels may be required?
Look, we've been advised today by the PM that it's approximately 7,000 people coming in a day, and that's across the all of the CBD gateways. I think for Sydney, we're looking at somewhere around 3,000 people coming through on Sunday, Monday, and again from from a CBD's perspective, there should be no problems with being able to house those numbers, considering that the hotels are really running on extremely low occupancy, so there's plenty of space to take them in.
Couple of quick ones, logistics. Do hotels have an opportunity to say yes or no choice?
We've actually had multiple hotels already register their interest, so I think we'll be absolutely fine from that perspective. And a lot of the hotels have already been participating in self-isolation for the last few weeks, so they've got self-isolating floors prepped and ready to go. The challenge will be to take hotels from sub 10% back to full.
If there's any current guests, what happens to them?
Our current guests, again, would be on separate floors, or there may even be a situation where they may, if the government decides to take over the entirety of the hotel, then those guests may need to move.
Okay, you've got to assume a number will test positive. How will you manage them? Will you segregate them?
I was going to say, well, prior to them coming into the hotels, they will be doing temperature checks and checks which we've seen happen previously. They will go immediately to hospital. And then the guests that are actually staying in self-isolation, if they find that they become unwell, they'll certainly make it known, and the health authorities will certainly deal with that on behalf of the hotel.
On a positive note, I mean, I spoke to the Accor hotel chain this afternoon who told me that they're in single occupancy levels, single digits, never had that before. So I guess this could also be a boost for the industry. Do you see jobs coming from this?
I certainly see us being able to put people back to work, and as much as we don't know what the length of time as to how long this will go on, obviously it can't be unlimited, but it's certainly an opportunity for some revenue and some jobs to be reinitiated, which is a good thing for the industry.
Michael, thank you for your time tonight.
No problems. Thanks very much, Melissa.
And in a few minutes, I'll be speaking to the Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, for her view and to expand on a few of those issues as well. Now, a fit and healthy grandfather from Western Australia has been identified as the state's latest coronavirus victim. 73-year-old Ray Daniels, who had no existing medical conditions, showed no symptoms until he collapsed on Wednesday morning.
This is a photo of Ray Daniels. Ray is a husband, a father of one of my police officers, actually, and a grandfather.
Mr Davis contracted the virus aboard the Celebrity Solstice cruise ship.
As the infection rates increase, our hospitals are expected to come under serious strain. Professor Tony Blakeley is an epidemiologist from the University of Melbourne and has been looking at how our health system will cope. Tony, thanks for your time. The big question is, under our current restrictions, will we have enough beds in intensive care?
I think so, but we've got time to work it out and we have mechanisms to work it out. So basically the interventions that were put on last weekend, we would expect to see that coming through in the number of cases registered in about another week's time. So it takes about 2 weeks to flow through. And we'll be watching those extremely closely because we know, given on how many cases coming through, how many ICU beds that will translate to. And so we have the ability to tweak, to turn the knobs up and down a little bit. And so if it looks like it's going too high, then we can move into more of a lockdown. If it looks like it's going right, we can track as we are now. And we have time. We have several weeks before the peak in ICU bed admissions to plan this and monitor it and project it.
OK, well, good to know that we've got a little bit of time that we could do this. The other question then is flattening out the curve. We keep using that term. Is there a date or a time frame on when you could see that happening?
Well, some of your listeners may have seen these graphs that go up completely linearly in the log form, which is called exponential growth. We're expecting those curves, the cumulative number of cases per day in a log scale, to start tipping. And we should see that about next weekend if the measures that we put in place last weekend, so from about the 21st to 24th of March, that's when we really shifted into social distancing, if they're working, we should start to see those curves starting to bend a little bit next weekend. And then the weekend after that, so in 2 weeks from today, we'll get a good idea whether they're bending enough. And then we can act accordingly. If they're not bending, we'll probably go into lockdown at that point. OK, so if they go that way, do I take some joy from that? I mean, is that a glimmer of hope that you're giving us tonight? Well, I know the maths of how these viruses work, and the amount of social distancing that your cameraman and I have had, for example, this evening, is enough to stop that spread. If enough people practice in those behaviours, we will see the number of people passing it on come down. The little wee quirk in here at the moment is the majority of our cases to this point, and perhaps still now, are people from overseas coming in to Australia. Now that we've locked the borders and got that very strict quarantine we've been talking about tonight, the way that it unfolds from now will be more predictable, and that's not just for fun for us people in the ivory towers to do our maths and stuff. It's because if it's more predictable, we can do better forecasting for the politicians and the Australian public, so we can work out whether we're on track or not.
That makes so much sense, but we've just got to do what we're told.
Essentially, but I think it's also more important that the government actually releases some of their modelling estimates at the moment. I think the public, from all the people who've contacted me, they want more information, they want to know how it is, they want to see those numbers, they want to be part of understanding how those decisions have been made.
All right, we will campaign for that too. Professor Blakeley, thank you. Thanks for your time.
Mel, this is an interesting one. Have a look at this. Patient 0, this has been identified today. The first person known to have COVID-19 has reportedly been identified as a 57-year-old seafood merchant from a market. Remember those wet markets we've spoken about in Wuhan. According to the Wall Street Journal, the woman began to feel sick on December 10th. She thought it was a cold, though. She was treated at a local clinic, then went back to work spreading the virus to others, and her condition worsened 8 days later and she was hospitalised. The good news is she has since recovered, so that was patient 0 identified there, which is quite fascinating.
But nervous. I don't know if you'd want to be identified.
No, I know, but think about it though. December 10,
yep.
One patient, first patient to now to global pandemic, 4 months later. Wow. It's quite extraordinary.
Isn't it?
All right. Now, let's have a look at the situation in the United States tonight. More than 80,000 cases, more than 1,000 deaths. The country is the new hotbed of this crisis, overtaking China and Italy. And our US Bureau Chief Ashley Mullaney is live for us tonight in Washington, D.C. Ash, hello to you. The numbers really are staggering. How did it get to this there?
Yeah, I think, Michael, to look at how this has played out and to look at the timeline here in the United States, we have to go back to January, which is when we saw the first confirmed case, which was a man in Washington state. He just returned from Wuhan. The following day, the president here said, he was asked, had he been briefed by the CDC? Was he concerned that this could become a pandemic? And he said, no, this is under control in the United States. Well, we now know that's simply not the case. This has just exploded across the country in a staggering time frame, really, particularly in New York, which is such a dense city, a international hub. So it's a very concerning time here, and yeah. I think we've seen this described as like a war, and in some ways with the lag in testing, it's like the enemy has been firing on the people here, and we're only now just starting to see how many people have actually been injured.
Well, the US President Donald Trump obviously has had some controversial comments along the way, but let's listen to what he had to say about those troubling case numbers.
It's a tribute to the amount of testing that we're doing. We're doing tremendous testing, and I'm sure you're not able to tell what China is testing or not testing. I think that's a little hard. Ultimately, it's a very devastating thing, but we will vanquish this virus, and it's a lot of progress has been made.
Right, Ash, give us your take if you don't mind. I mean, how is this emergency actually being managed there? Is the health system overwhelmed?
Well, the short answer is yes. We're already seeing emergency workers crying out for help at the moment across the country, particularly in New York. I mean, issues with personal protective equipment. I think the key issue here is going to be ventilators as well. I mean, no country in the world, not even the richest nation like America, could have been prepared completely for the onslaught of this virus that we're seeing now. And I mean, then there's the policy side of it, the politics, like you say, and it's really been a patchwork of policy here in America. We're not seeing, while the numbers now are similar to China, or we've surpassed China, the policies to keep this under control or to hit that curve are different. It's a patchwork of policies across the country, and I think there's been a reluctance really early on there was an acknowledgement that this was perhaps a global crisis, but a reluctance to admit that this was going to be an American health crisis, one like we're seeing now, Mush.
Quite incredible, Ash. Do you know, there's a beautiful moment as we're talking to you. It's coming up first light there. Hear the birds in the background? Dead quiet in Washington, D.C., but it's a beautiful dawn.
Yeah, there's no one around at the moment. We're the only people standing outside the White House at the moment right now, and you have to look for the silver lining sometimes, Mush.
It's a nice one, Ash. Good on you. Thank you for that from Washington, D.C. tonight. Let's return to those new restrictions we were talking about at the beginning of the show surrounding Australians returning from overseas and who will be forced to quarantine in a hotel as of midnight tomorrow. Earlier I spoke with the Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, and asked her just how many of your returning family and friends could be impacted.
It's difficult to estimate, I think, Michael, because we know that at any one time there are usually hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Australians travelling overseas. Since the 17th of March and the travel advice we issued on that date about advising Australians who wanted to come home, we estimate about 200,000 Australian citizens and permanent residents have returned. That's a very significant number. But even so, I know that there are large groups of citizens still overseas who are looking for commercial flights where they're available and also looking for some support from government in some cases.
Some numbers we were looking at this afternoon would suggest that the surge has happened, that the bulk of Australians who do want to come home have come home, but still about 7,000 or so a day are trickling through. Does that sound about right to you?
That does, through multiple ports in Australia, and that's very, very low, as you would appreciate. But now, of course, with the decisions that have been taken in relation to quarantine, given that the bulk of infections in Australia can be traced back to somebody who has travelled overseas or had contact with somebody who has travelled overseas, now that we've taken those decisions, of course, I expect that those numbers will reflect that outcome.
What progress has been made getting Australians on board the dozens of vessels, there's quite a few of them, around the world home? I think at last count there might have been 3,000 or so Australians on board. What's the progress there?
Well, we estimate there are now about 22 ships from in excess of 30 and that there are now just over 2,000 passengers remaining on those vessels. That is a case-by-case proposition as well, because they are scattered to the four winds. They're in Europe, they're in South America, they're in the United States, they're in our own region. So in those conditions, we are working closely with the cruise lines, and the cruise lines are taking a very active role in this, as you would expect and as they should, to ensure that they are supporting their passengers in very, very difficult circumstances. We know that some, for example, from the Norwegian Doyle returned to Australia just this week as part of a very determined effort on that cruise line's part, a charter flight, and of course they are now in isolation and quarantine in Sydney.
That situation off the WA coast today seems to have been resolved with the cruise ship there. I think German travellers on board the Atania, they've been allowed to come ashore. Those that are well, been flown straight home on charter flights. Is that the sort of cooperation we're talking about and you're seeing extended around the world?
That is absolutely the sort of cooperation, and I know that was discussed literally at the G20 leaders meeting, extraordinary leaders meeting overnight, because we know that the pressures are everywhere. They're not just being felt here in Australia. Of course, we do have a very large travelling population, an enthusiastic travelling population, so a lot of Australians overseas, but it doesn't really matter where you are at the moment in the world. Those pressures are being felt. The cooperation in the example that you've raised about the Artania is between Germany, between the Western Australian government, the Commonwealth government, all working together to make sure we get a durable outcome.
And what's the update on the evacuation flight for the Australians trapped in Peru and Uruguay? When can we expect that they'll be back? I know there's limitations on the number of flights out of there.
There are indeed very strict limitations, particularly in Peru and in terms of both the number of flights and where they're able to land. I hope to see, very optimistic in terms of that flight, that it departs on Sunday. That will be the first flight. We will need to pursue options for further flights given the number of Australians who are in Peru, and that is a process which is underway. The second flight, which is coming back from South America, will be coming out of Uruguay. and I think that will happen earlier next week with cruise ship passengers on board that one.
We talked about some numbers at the start of the interview, but have you done an audit of Australian travellers around the world? Might there be other pockets of travellers who are a bit more remote, need assistance getting home? Anyone we've left behind?
Well, we're not intending to leave people behind. At the same time, though, it is very, very difficult to indicate we can move absolutely everybody, given where some people are, how long they have been there, and their own personal arrangements, of course. But we do know there are pockets of Australians who have been particularly impacted by domestic restrictions in the countries in which they're located, and, of course, by commercial airline shutdowns. Argentina is one example, Nepal is another, and South Africa a third. There are others, but they are three examples I would proffer. So we will be talking with airlines, particularly Qantas and Virgin, about where they can support us, working with them to get Australians back home, and the government will facilitate that on a case-by-case basis in terms of there being no other feasible options, no commercial options, and making sure that we are able to support Australians.
Final question about our region, Foreign Minister. We're a great supporter of our neighbours, some of our poorer neighbours in the Pacific region. This must be devastating for them and could wipe out some communities. What are we doing to help the Pacific Island nations, Solomon Islands, PNG and the many others?
That's a really good question, and working closely with the Solomon Islands, with Papua New Guinea, in fact with the entire Pacific Island Forum membership, to ensure that where we can, we are providing them with support. So we have individual Australians who are health professionals who are part of our capacity building and our inline support in their health systems. We have contributions of personal protective equipment where we have been able to do that, and that is very much also a continuing conversation. They are, thankfully, at this point in time, and I don't want to tempt fate here, but thankfully experiencing very low levels of infection. And I very much hope that it stays that way, but we are very alert to the challenge that it would present to a Pacific nation or Timor-Leste to have a higher level of infection, and we will continue to work very closely with their governments. I'm very proud of the Australians who do that work in support of those countries. Very proud of the Australians who are at work in our region.
They do good work in those regions, there's no doubt about that. Good to talk to you again. Foreign Minister Marise Payne, thanks for joining The Latest.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, in the middle of all the fear, because we've been talking about those, we're looking for the lovely moments. So as the United Kingdom battles the spread of coronavirus, there was a lovely touch last night when Britons who are in lockdown took a moment to publicly applaud the efforts of their National Health Service. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and members of the royal family were among the millions showing their support with a clap for carers. That's the cute one.
The Cambridge kids.
Yeah.
That was really good, wasn't it?
It's nice, though. But I think we should all do it, too.
I think that was a really
for all of our carers. They're
lovely
incredible.
thing to get going, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was nice.
All right, still to come. Mystery infections. We look into the alarming rise in the number of people contracting the virus from unknown sources.
Winter and the traditional flu season is on the way. Will the cold weather make things worse?
An intimate wedding in the age of corona.
And as the virus starts to hit our regional communities, how will our smaller towns cope? That is next on The Latest from 7 News.
There's been a rise in what they're calling mystery cases of COVID-19 in Australia, people contracting the virus from unknown sources. So the big question is, how is this happening?
Let's bring in our panel of experts, infectious disease physician Dr. Sanjaya Senanayake and infectious disease expert Dr. Clay Golledge. Gents, good evening. Sanjaya, if I can start with you, how do you explain people are getting the coronavirus without knowing where they got it from, and how concerned should we be by this?
Look, hi Mel, it should be a matter of concern because the key to stopping this outbreak is finding people with the infection and isolating them so they can't spread it to other people. So if there's someone out there in the community who's got the infection and we don't know who it is, then they have the opportunity to infect others and you can set up chains of transmission within the community. Now, as to how that can happen, well, if someone's coughing and spluttering within 1.5 metres of you, in this particular climate, you'll remember it. But if you're in a room, a meeting room, an office building or a house with someone who may be sneezing a little, coughing a little for 2 hours, you may not remember that, and you may not remember touching a surface that they've contaminated. And you certainly won't remember touching a surface that they contaminated a few hours earlier. So it's the same methods of infection, but you may not realise it's happened. That's why hand hygiene is so important.
Clay, let's bring you in now, and I think this is a really concerning area. We're seeing coronavirus spread to more regional centres across the country. Now, do you think we'll see more cases in remote areas? And importantly, a lot of our regional areas do not have ICU facilities at all if it goes really wrong. So what's going to happen here?
In the regional centres, I guess we've got to be worried. You've got a triple-edged sword, lower population density, that's good. More susceptible people, that's bad. And more limited healthcare, also bad. So we've just got to limit the number of people. Now, I'm supposed to be in Broome this weekend, but I'm standing here talking to you guys. Just got to limit the number of people that go to these centres to try and reduce the chance that these people are going to get infected, particularly when you've got so many vulnerable people in those rural and regional centres.
Could our regional areas cope if they had to deal with really intensive care cases of this?
Oh, no, not at all. If you look at regional Western Australia, there's just a handful of intensive care beds. If we look up in the Kimberley, they've virtually got nothing at all. So really all they can do is just temporarily ventilate somebody and then put them on a plane back to Perth. So, yes, they can't cope really, and nor should they be able to cope either. So we've got to keep those cases to an absolute minimum, ideally keep them out of the regional areas altogether.
Sanjaya, there are reports of people in China contracting the virus a second time. Why would that happen?
Yes, Mel. So the question is, are they actually contracting it a second time? So there have been studies showing that people who've definitely had COVID-19, they've been released from hospital after having 2 negative swabs on consecutive days, and then they've been followed up in the community when they're at home. They've been swabbed again and found to be positive. But they themselves don't have symptoms. People in their household aren't sick. So I suspect what we are seeing is the terminal phase of the original infection. And we do see this with other viral infections where well people keep shedding the virus for a while. And you have to remember the test we're doing for the virus doesn't necessarily tell us if it's live virus or dead virus.
Clay, winter's on the way, as is our traditional flu season. The colder weather, that could make things worse, although we need the weather exactly where you're standing. It looks beautiful and sunny, and warm weather, which is the enemy, I think, of this virus. But the cold weather's on the way. Should we be worried?
Yeah, I guess we should be. And again, we've got to look at both sides of the equation. The virus probably survives better in colder, drier climate. In hot, humid climates, UV light, that probably reduces the chances of the virus surviving. So that's good. What of course, we're going to have our advantage is that we're not going to be all crowded into areas where there's going to be transmission. So with our separation now, we're not going to get that respiratory virus transmission going on so avidly. And of course, what we must do is make sure that we don't get influenza as well. So everybody who can have the vaccine, unless you've got an allergy, which is very few people, you must have the flu vaccine as well, because what you don't want to get, you do not want to get COVID and the flu vaccine simultaneously. So I guess it balances itself out. Colder weather, less preferable, but less crowding, distancing. Hopefully that will balance itself out in time. Who knows?
All right, good one. Doctors, we really appreciate your time this Friday night as well. Very good of you. Thank you. Now, last weekend it was Bondi Beach in Sydney. Tonight, Melbourne St Kilda Beach has been officially shut. You can see there, after hundreds of people ignored social distancing regulations. Packs of beachgoers were seen out sunbathing today, many close together. You can see the police moving in, despite government warnings to stay at home. At 6 p.m. tonight, the authorities moved in. They closed the beach to the public. The message is not getting through to some. And Woolies has announced 20,000 new jobs will be available across the country to help meet the increased demand for supplies. There'll be roles in supermarkets, e-commerce, supply chains and drinks businesses. Those positions are expected to be filled within the next month. And Queensland residents are heading to the polls tomorrow for local elections and 2 state by-elections. The Electoral Commissioner hinted that SES volunteers will be called upon to maintain social distancing in these extreme times, and there's no risk in going to vote if people bring their own pen or pencil.
Now, there's a lot of anxiety surrounding when and if we might go into a full lockdown. And with us to crunch the numbers is senior reporter Denham Hitchcock. Denham, when did other countries make that move?
Well, it varies, but their experience gives us a roadmap, and we're not in lockdown. I would call it heavy restrictions. But to find out when it might change, let's look at when other countries have gone into lockdown and at what stage. Down the bottom is the number of days since 100 cases, and Italy has always been a study of what not to do. It took them 18 days before they went into full lockdown. By then, they had more than 15,000 people infected and over 1,000 deaths. Spain has been another hotspot, again, slow to react. They shut down hard at 12 days, already with skyrocketing cases. Now, South Korea. This country is the perfect model. They got on top of it quickly and they flattened their curve within weeks. Lightning fast reaction though, only one day after passing the 100 mark. They introduced tough restrictions, not a full lockdown, just restrictions. At that stage, they only had 2 deaths. So, where does Australia fit into all this? We are currently at 17 days past that 100 mark. 3,000 cases, 13 deaths. But our restrictions are very similar to South Korea. Not a full lockdown yet, and maybe like South Korea, Michael, it won't be needed.
Let's cross our fingers. We certainly seem to be heading in the right direction there, Denham. It's interesting to watch that curve every night, isn't it? And the way Denham explains it. So, OK position, but we've still got to keep doing exactly what we've been told to do. Isolate tonight. Stay indoors if you can. Still to come, we check in on 2 Aussie sisters, speaking of that, quarantined with corona, as one is rushed back to hospital with a second wave of symptoms.
An intimate wedding in the age of corona. We have your seat at that service.
And Zoom and house party. Get used to these 2 things. We chat about the really great technology allowing you to still enjoy your Friday night drinks and catch up. It's all coming up next on the latest from 7 News.
Two sisters, 19 and 24 years old, are isolating at home in Sydney after contracting COVID-19 in Switzerland. Kat and Jasmine Talbot are both young and healthy, but the severity of the virus has been different for each of them. So I spoke to Jasmine about what has happened since they landed back in Australia.
Well, first of all, we went through the airport and there were certain security measures and they made it pretty clear that we had to self-isolate for 14 days. And then we got home and started to feel a little sick. Kat slept for about 15 hours straight, having slept through the entire flight. And I started to get headaches and a runny nose and a bit of a cough. But I kind of had that before, so I put it just sort of down to jet lag. Then we both just started feeling some pretty horrendous body aches and pains like you do with the normal flu.
You're up to about day 10, am I right? And Kat had a little stint in hospital.
Her lymph nodes have flared up, which they think is linked to the virus itself. So what I've been told is that you get your initial symptoms at about day 4 to 6, which is kind of what I assume what we had. And then from day 10 to 14, they can flare up again. And that's what they think this is with her. She woke up with a really swollen face and it was quite painful and just sort of achy all over again. So rather than go to our GP, obviously, because we can't do that once we've had a confirmed case, we went to the hospital instead. Well, she went to the hospital. I stayed home.
So isolation's going okay for you girls?
Yeah, it was weird having Kat leave this morning because we've been pretty much one person. She was suddenly gone and I was sort of like, I don't really know what to do with myself.
Jasmine, what sort of instructions were you given then for quarantine?
The recommendation or the guidelines that we have at the moment are to have 72 hours completely symptom-free and at least 10 days from the first day of symptoms before we can start sort of interacting with anyone else. But above all of that, the home isolation team will call us when we're allowed to sort of break our isolation.
Have they been checking up on you? Has anyone made sure you're at home?
No, actually. No one's actually checked up on us just yet.
Probably the biggest group who can't fully wrap their head around this are the millennials. What's your message to anyone watching who thinks they're going to be okay?
Just wash your hands and stay at home. like, the reason Kat and I got it in the first place is because we were in very close quarters with a lot of other people. We're all pretty young, fit, healthy people who are there to do physical activities like skiing and snowboarding. And we've all had it and suffered because of it. Don't think that you're above it, because as you can see with us, we're not.
But all the best to you girls. Thanks for sharing your story.
Thanks.
It's good to hear firsthand what's going on.
I know, but I was really surprised no one's checking on them.
Yeah, very much so. Well, still to come, guest restrictions and social distancing. Have a look at that. What a wedding looks like during the pandemic.
And nothing will get in the way of Friday night drinks. How technology is keeping us connected. That is next on the latest from 7 News. A wedding day should be one of the most cherished memories of any couple, but the tough new restrictions have made it a very different day, and Denham is back to walk us down the aisle.
I certainly am. A wedding in the age of corona is what you might call a very private affair, and it's not just the couples affected here, but the entire industry, the venues, the florists, the planners, the DJs, the marriage celebrants, the lot.
My name is Genevieve McGrath. I'm an authorised marriage celebrant. I've been a celebrant since 2015 and absolutely love what I do. Every wedding just seems to get better and better, and I somehow managed to fall in love with my job even more. Since the outbreak of the virus, like many vendors in the wedding industry, my business has been really sincerely hit. It just feels like overnight what I've worked so hard to build up has sort of come crashing down, but I'm really feeling for couples at the moment. As I've found since becoming a celebrant, love does always find a way. We can still have ceremonies go ahead, and I feel very fortunate to be able to marry the couple that I will be later today.
I'm Scott.
I'm Chrissy.
This is our wedding day.
We've gathered here today to celebrate a beautiful love shared by two people.
I call upon the persons here present to witness that I, Scott John Warren, take you, Christine and Grace Hagan, to be my wedded wife. The trip to Thailand is cancelled, unfortunately.
Unfortunately had to cancel our honeymoon, but that's okay.
I stand here today as my heart beats for you, as it has done since the moment we met.
In a couple of weeks we were going to have a big family celebration, but that's no longer going ahead as well.
It is my absolute pleasure to pronounce you Chrissy and Scott, husband and wife.
Yay! So even though it didn't go 100% as planned, we're just so happy that we were able to get married. It's just such a wonderful feeling to marry the absolute love of your life.
Yeah, nothing could really ruin this day. Obviously, I've got my stunning bride right here, and yeah, I couldn't be happier.
Yeah, beach wedding, bringing back some good memories for me as well. Just one of the ways, Mel, we're realising how much of our social fabric depends on social interaction.
Yeah, I think we're all missing hugs, aren't we?
You are indeed. Wish them all the well, though. All the best. It's fantastic.
Thanks, Denham.
We wanted to share this with you also from one of our own. Our political reporter, Olivia Leeming, sharing a pretty stark image today from her grandfather's funeral. In her words, it is the reality of the new funeral restrictions, 8 chairs only, no consoling allowed, an incredibly difficult day for her and for all of those who are grieving loved ones under these pretty trying circumstances.
Oh, that picture.
Yeah.
It's just stark.
There you go. All right, still to come. Is it time for Australia to go into complete lockdown? We asked that question.
And the thoroughly modern way to maintain a social life but keep your distance is next on the latest from 7 News.
Well, no matter what age or background, there's one topic that is certainly capturing the attention of every Australian. Will we go into complete lockdown? For more, let's have a chat about this with journalist Carolyn Overington and commentator Dee Madigan, who sometimes join us, and they're on the other end of Skype tonight. Ladies, thanks so much for joining the latest again. Let me ask you this. The New South Wales Premier is certainly feeling the pressure to put the state into lockdown. The Victorian Premier has pushed toward further closures. Dee, the big question, should Australia go into further lockdown?
Well, it kind of feels like we half are and half aren't at the moment, which I think is really confusing for people. So you've got all these shops that are open, but no one's going to the shops, and you almost feel sorry for them because they're having to staff them and keep them open, and for what? So, you know, if it is inevitable, I'd almost rather it just happen.
Carolyn, what about you? Should the entire nation be forced to stay home?
No, I don't think so. I think that day comes when the Chief Medical Officer and the advisors to the government say that it's an imperative, and at the moment we're not there. And one of the things that I'm worried about is that there's a big call in the media. There are certain commentators who are shouting for the country to go into lockdown. I'm not really sure that we entirely know what that means until we see it. Yeah. I mean, there has been an absolute calamity unfolding in Australian society. Many millions of people have already lost their jobs. Now, if you talk about a total and complete shutdown, I'm not sure that we can predict the outcome. Once you start to see renters default on their rental payments, mortgagees default on their home loans, people being evicted from their homes, sometimes forcibly, with nowhere to go and no jobs to go to, you're starting to talk about a complete and total social breakdown, a community breakdown. You'll see a run on the banks, and we're getting then into the kind of catastrophe that we really are not prepared for. So I think slowly is better. Now, the Prime Minister has said that our slow and steady closure of public spaces and public eateries is working for now. So let's listen to his advice and not that of some of the loud, shouty people out there.
Dee, is the slow and steady approach to an exponential crisis, is that the right way to go, do you think?
Look, I'm not sure. The graph of cases suggested otherwise, although New South Wales looked a little bit better in the last day or so. You know, I don't know the answer to it. My concern is that by putting it off, we actually end up in a worse case than we do by sort of trying to sort of get a hold of it now.
Dee, just touch on briefly, I guess, the mixed messaging, although I think some of the messaging has become a bit more clearer, certainly at the federal level, but the states want to go to some further restrictions of their own. Do you think that messaging has been right? Are the premiers going against the PM here or not?
Well, I think each state actually has its own unique circumstances. They all have different amounts of cases, and some of those have more amounts of domestic cases, if you like, and some have more amounts of cases where they can be overseas traced. So I think the premiers have the right to make their own decisions based on their individual state needs.
Carolyn, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, the messaging has been confusing, stay home, but the shops are open, that kind of thing. But the bigger problem has been people just not doing what they're told. I mean, they were told not to gather in large groups many days ago, and still today we had the police having to clear large crowds from St Kilda Beach. They were told many times not to do many of the things that they are continuing to do. For example, the characters we've seen sort of slipping under the barriers to swim at Bondi when you're being told not to do it. The law applies to everyone. Now, if you take a look at any of the people who are actually suffering from this virus, the heartbreaking statement put out by the family in WA today who have lost their loved one, who was a very well individual taken down by coronavirus, you wouldn't be taking these risks. I get that people are bored. I get that people are frustrated. I know it's hard when you've got small children or indeed adult children in the house with you, but we have to do what we're told.
All right, let's lift it a little with a positive message. It's Friday night. You might usually be out for a work drinks, catching up with family, dropping around to friends' houses. Those things are just not happening. OK, we've been asked to live our lives very, very differently. Most of us are. But virtual catch-ups are becoming commonplace. It's really exploded this week thanks to video chatting apps like House Party and Zoom. Dee, it's a great way to communicate. Does it leave older generation or those without any access to internet a bit out in the cold, though?
Look, it does, and as great as these apps are, you've brought up a good point. There are 2.5 million Australians without internet access. So when we say, self-isolate, work from home, for some people that's not an option. They just don't have it. You know, we also have a second-rate NBN, another story entirely.
We'll do that next week.
You've got kids in remote communities who are not going to be able to get their schooling because it can't be delivered by internet. You've got old people who might be digital savvy who can't access it as well. So these apps are great, but don't forget there are 2.5 million Australians who are not getting access.
Carolyn, are you going to be Zooming or house partying on the apps tonight?
Do you know what? I live in an apartment complex and we've got this thing going called Pen Pals for the pandemic.
Yeah.
And kids are going around and they're writing letters to some of the elderly residents and popping them in the mailbox. And we all thought it would be great for the elderly residents, but do you know who really loves to see a letter in the letterbox? The kids do. They just love it. I've just had to say to them, you know, make sure nobody licks the envelopes. But it's been a really nice way of keeping everyone connected.
No, it's delightful, isn't it? All right, Carolyn D, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Stay safe.
We'll be right back with your Saturday weather forecast here on the latest from 7 News. Welcome back. We're looking over Reykjavik in Iceland tonight. It's 0 degrees there right now, a bit bleak. That amazing cathedral there. We'll leave the shot up and have a look at our temperatures. A little warm around Australia, 27 in Brisbane, mostly sunny in Melbourne, Adelaide a top of 30, Perth some showers.
And in other parts of the country, Innisfail showers, Cooma 21 and mostly sunny, Ceduna a top of 33 and 28 and partly cloudy in Geraldton. Thank you for your company this evening. From the team here at 7 News, that is The Latest. I'm Melissa Doyle.
And I'm Michael Usher. We're going to leave you tonight with a brief but important message from our earlier interview with the Foreign Minister. Good night.
Have a good weekend. And everybody, #stay home.